So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we pick up now with the Fantastic Four issue number 579. Now this and issue number 580, these are what we call filler issues. These are not wildly important to the overall happenings of Hickman's Fantastic Four, but the reason why we're covering them is because there are events that will transpire later on in his run of the Fantastic Four that will require us to know about this. The first is that Spider-Man will become part of the events, but also Doctor Doom will become part of the events. But the other half of this is that Hickman is going to launch a story called the Future Foundation. And the Future Foundation will basically be a tie-in to his run of the Fantastic Four, and it'll be like Batman with Detective Comics, where it gives us the other half of what's going on with regards to the events as they're transpiring. Now, with this story, what we're told is that Reed Richards has journeyed to Golden, Colorado to pick up with something called the Singularity Conference. Now, the Singularity Conference does actually exist. I wouldn't say this is something like TED Talk, but as far as I understand, it is basically a research conference. It involves some of the top minds that focus on artificial intelligence. Now, again, I'm not really knowledgeable about it, so I can't offer too much on that discussion, but what I can say is that within the Marvel Universe, as far as Jonathan Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four is concerned, the Singularity Conference was created by Reed Richards in Marvel Comics, and it was designed for the purpose of bringing the world's top scientific minds together to basically solve the world's problems, to move the world in a more progressive and prolific direction. But the issue here is that Reed Richards has yet to see this conference do this. And what I mean is that as he's talking to them, of course, he praises She-Hulk for the fact that, being in the legal profession, she's basically written articles about the laws of artificial intelligence and about the laws of technology and how they relate to what goes on in the world at the moment. But for Reed, this was designed to genuinely be a technological masterpiece. But instead of being that, the individuals who were part of the Singularity Conference have basically allowed their politics to run the show. Instead of writing articles and instead of focusing on, is artificial intelligence a realistic goal, or are advances in technology a realistic goal, it's turned into an argument of is artificial intelligence and is technology, are those realistic goals insofar as their political views about religion and various social issues around the country. And the result is that Reed's basically come to the belief that they've all failed at their task. They've all failed the conference and they failed their purpose. And so what Reed Richards ends up doing is he doesn't really disassemble the entire concept of the Singularity Conference. Instead, he leaves. He basically quits. He walks away and says that everything is all said and done. And so the following week, what we do is we pick up with his arrival back at the Baxter Building. Now, we're not really told what he was doing during this time, and we don't really need to know. But what is important here is that after talking to Johnny Storm, after talking to the various members of the Fantastic Four and just kind of associating with them and being welcomed back, what we're told is that he's basically reached out to the smartest people or the smartest children in the Marvel Universe. So he's reached out to his own children, Franklin and Valeria. Now, I wouldn't say Franklin is one of the smartest people in the world, but because of the fact that he's a child of Reed Richards, of course, Reed Richards is going to bring his son into the fold. But Valeria, as we've discussed, is genuinely extremely intelligent. She's as smart as Reed Richards, if not smarter, depending on what it is that's going on. But the reason why she has the edge and the reason why all these other kids were brought in as part of this group is because they have imagination. They're not restricted by politics. They're not restricted by how they want the world to be. They're restricted by how they look at the world. And so to them, there is no limit. Anything can happen. Anything can be done. And this is exactly what Reed was looking for. And so after talking to these various individuals, after talking to the various students, and when them asking the question, why are they all there? What Reed says is that they are the Future Foundation. They're there to basically help him solve the problem of everything, but more so than that, to basically look to the future, to look to the horizon and to move the world into a better direction. Now, the reason why I brought this up, this is actually kind of a sub-story. This is a side story that's actually going to be pretty interesting later on down the line, and it will tie into Reed's failing in attempting to solve the problem of everything, is basically the events of Ben Grimm. For those of you guys who have looked at Ben Grimm historically as a character that's routinely been a part of the Fantastic Four and always fought alongside them, you may see him in a couple different ways. You may see him as a character who's basically just kind of the comedic relief. He cracks his jokes and he calls it a day. You may look at him as the strong guy of the team. He basically is not really the hired muscle, but he's basically the muscle of the team. He does what the other members of the team can't do when it comes to sheer strength. But one of the major cornerstones of Ben Grimm's character is that he's always struggled with the fact that he can never go back to the way he was before. Now, there have been attempts made by Reed Richards to basically cure him, but they've always failed, and in some instances, they've been catastrophic in the sense that they've completely changed the way Ben Grimm looks. And in fact, if you go look at some of the John Byrne artistry on the Fantastic Four, there was one point in time whereby his physical appearance became very edgy and very rocky, in the sense that instead of looking kind of smooth the way he does now, he had a lot of sharp edges. And the reason why is because that was a result of Reed Richards meddling around and attempting to cure him. And so what happens here is the first task of the Future Foundation is to try to cure Ben Grimm. And this is one of the coolest things about this, because this is Hickman basically telling us that, again, these kids have unbridled imagination. There's no limit to what they can do, but more so than that, they're better working as a group than they are as individuals. And this again highlights the limit of Reed Richards. Reed Richards is just one man. He can only look at the world through his own eyes, but with a group of kids who have unlimited imagination putting their minds to task, they can effectively solve anything. And what we find out is that Valeria begins speaking with Ben Grimm, and they initially present the idea of returning him back to his human form, of basically making him normal again. But Ben Grimm again shies away from it just because of his checkered past with Reed Richards attempting to do this. And so what we're told by both Franklin and Valeria and a couple other kids is that the problem with Reed Richards trying to cure Ben Grimm is he wasn't looking at Ben Grimm for what he was. He was looking at Ben Grimm's entire change as something on the surface as opposed to a fundamental change. And this is actually really cool because Hickman gives us a little bit of modification on the powers of the Fantastic Four. For the longest time, when the Fantastic Four had their abilities, Reed Richards stretching, Johnny Storm being able to, set himself on fire and so on and so forth, we always had this notion that maybe it was just something that Reed and that Susan Storm and that Johnny Storm could control. They tapped into some aspect of their brain and they were able to manifest these things. But what Hickman tells us through the Future Foundation is that this is not the case. That basically Johnny Storm, Susan Storm, and Reed Richards have like an on-off switch for their powers, but they're still a genetic part of who they are. So when it comes down to the very fundamental, the core level of the Fantastic Four, in a lot of ways, they're no different than the X-Men. The only difference here is that instead of a gene activating that caused their powers, instead their bodies were modified on the genetic level. And so the result is that Ben Grimm does not have this on-off switch. He doesn't have the ability to modify his genetic code. And so what Franklin Richards and what Valeria Richards and the rest of the Future Foundation do is they basically say that they've come up with a way for him to do this. They've come up with a way for him to effectively turn his power off. And what they do is they present him with a substance, with a chemical of sorts that he can consume and that will make him human for only 1 week. Now, this is extremely important. And the reason why is because in the next video, and what we're actually going to do in the next few discussions or so, is one, we're going to talk about the death of Johnny Storm, but two, once we get further into this and we actually get into Nathaniel Richards visiting Reed Richards again, we're going to learn that there's actually a lot more to this substance. And not only is it going to make Ben Grimm human for a week, it's actually going to have unforeseen consequences. And this is gonna, again, be Hickman's way of telling us that Reed Richards doesn't know everything. And despite the fact that he has a Future Foundation, and despite the fact that these kids are all working together, in the end, they're actually going to screw up the life of Ben Grimm. They're going to, they're going to basically destroy it. Ben Grimm doesn't know it, they don't know it, and they won't know it for a little while. But it's actually a really cool series of events, and it's actually really interesting the way this whole little bit unfolds. And again, I really consider this to be just a great element of Hickman storytelling. It's just a cornerstone of storytelling. This thread doesn't go anywhere. It just shows us how things will turn out at a future point in time. However, following this, what we do is we pick up with Valeria Richards a short time later when she goes to visit Dr. Doom. Now, this little bit of the story actually requires some expansion on a few previously existing concepts. They're not wildly important, but they give us an idea of what's going on. During an event called the Fall of Hulks, which dealt with a group called the Intelligentsia, what we were told is that at some point prior to most of the large events have been going on in Marvel Comics, some of the smartest supervillains in the history of Marvel Comics had basically banded together as a sort of Illuminati-esque team of their own. And they had planned world domination and different things like that, but they were responsible for the creation of Red Hulk and so on and so forth. But the fact remains that Dr. Doom had been a part of their plan to basically take over everything. But during this conflict, as part of Fall of Hulk's Alpha, Dr. Doom had been captured alongside Reed Richards and a handful of other superheroes who were considered to be the top 8 smartest individuals on the planet Earth, which is actually where that list comes from when people talk about the smartest individuals in Marvel Comics. And what had happened was Doom's intelligence had effectively been siphoned off. Now, we didn't initially know this, and in fact, we didn't really know the outcome of it. All we knew was that Doom had seemed to have been shaken up by everything that was going on. And so what happens is that as Valeria Richards is making her way out of the Baxter building, she stumbles across the laboratory of Reed Richards and the portal that he had created that granted him access to the Council of Reeds. And what happens is she basically begins going over the holographic logs of Reed Richards, where he talks about everything that had happened. And what Valeria learns is that not only was Reed trying to solve the problem of everything, but she also learns that she can basically access this particular portal. And so what happens here, and this actually takes place off panel, though we find out later on what all had taken place, she basically accesses the portal. And so what happens is that once she's done, she leaves and she comes back to converse with Dr. Doom. Now, once we pick up with Doom, he's basically reflecting on how his intelligence had been siphoned away by the intelligentsia. And because of the fact that he's partially damaged, he basically reaches out for the purpose of taking his adopted son, Christophe Bernard, and assimilating the intelligence of Christophe Bernard, and in turn, basically using him to restore himself. Now, this tells us how sinister and how dark Dr. Doom is, but it also makes him really cool. I can't tell you exactly why, but there's something to be said about Dr. Doom willing to just kill innocent people for the purpose of ensuring his own legacy, of ensuring that he continues on. But before this plan can be fleshed out, before he can decide what it is that they do next, Valeria Richards appears. And so what happens is she begins talking to Dr. Doom. Now, something to keep in mind here is that when Valeria Richards was born to Susan Storm, Valeria Richards and Susan were going through birth complications, and it was actually Dr. Doom that effectively saved her life, that made it possible for Valeria to be born. And so he's sort of an uncle to her. He's basically a very close member to her, but even more so than that, and this is why I love Hickman's writing so much, is because she looks at him not really as a role model, but as a person whose intelligence is equal to, if not occasionally, a little bit less than her own. And so because of that, when it comes to the mind, he's an equal to her. And so she views him as maybe somebody she can consult. And that's what she's doing here. Because of the fact that the future Franklin Richards had appeared to Valeria and said, all hope lies in Doom, she's basically fulfilling this pact. She's finding out what it is or why it is that all hope lies with him. Now, again, she doesn't know how the future is going to turn out, but her logic dictates that if the future version of Franklin was going to come to the past and tell her all hope lies with Doom, then she better go visit Dr. Doom. And so what ends up happening here is that Dr. Doom, of course, she explains what all had gone on with her father, with Reed Richards creating a portal that allowed him to access the Council of Reeds. And when Dr. Doom asks what it is that she found when she went through the portal, but she shows us that some of the Reeds had been killed, that this Council of Reeds at this temple had basically been in total shambles. And what she tells us is that the Council of Reeds have effectively been destroyed in their entirety, or at least they appear to have been destroyed in their entirety. But she also says, and this is actually a very, very important thing, she also says that there are a whole bunch of versions of Dr. Doom that seem to have been lobotomized, and they're just living below the facility itself, the council chamber itself. And so when she travels into the building, she actually discovers that the Mad Celestials are still there, and the battle is still raging on, albeit with whatever few forces happen to be left behind. And so while these versions of Reed are doing what they can, in the end, again, it's just not enough, because we're talking about entities from a different reality that possess universal level power, that possess astronomical power. And so what ends up happening here is, while it's completely textless, while we don't really know everything that's going on, we know that Valeria is trying to help them, that most likely she talked to them, but we're not given the full explanation of what all had taken place. And this is actually interesting. I'm not really sure why Jonathan Hickman chose to go this route. I wouldn't go as far as to say it was a bad decision. It's just the effect that he was looking for was kind of lost on me when I was going through this. But what she tells Dr. Doom is that in the end, Reed made the wrong choice. And this is actually really interesting, because had Valeria made the decision, things would have been vastly different, and we actually would have seen the future of Franklin coming to fruition. But what she says here is that her father had the choice between solving the problem of humanity or else basically keeping his family. And because Reed chose to stay with his family, because he chose not to take the same road that all the other Reeds in the Council of Reeds chose, which was to basically abandon their families, that in the end he made the wrong choice and he screwed up. But more so than that, what's funny with this is that Valeria says that she notices something is off about Dr. Doom. Now, she does not know about the Fall of Hulk storyline. She does not know about those events as far as I'm aware. All she knows is that by virtue of the fact that Dr. Doom is twitching a bit in one of his hands because of the fact that he is perspiring because of the fact that he's showing characteristics that do not exude the normal kind of confidence that he puts off complete control of the situation, that something's not quite right. And Valeria immediately deduces that he has brain damage. And so the agreement that the two of them strike is that she will find a way to cure Dr. Doom's brain damage if Dr. Doom agrees to basically help Reed Richards whenever the time comes when that help is needed. Now, we will actually find this out later on following the death of Johnny Storm, and Dr. Doom is actually going to join the Future Foundation, which makes some really cool storytelling. It creates for some really cool dichotomy between himself and the rest of the Fantastic Four and the superheroes. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, and let me know what you guys think about Hickman's Fantastic Four so far, and I will catch you all later. Peace.